In this lesson, we are going to learn CSS or cascading style sheets. Based on the name, it's used to style our web page and change the appearance of our HTML elements. I have actually prepared a project that we can do in this lesson. We are going to open this project by going to work/buttons. On this web page, I have some really nice looking buttons from famous websites, namely YouTube and Twitter, that we can copy and practice our CSS with. We are going to create a new file for this exercise. So let's create a new file and call it buttons.html. And we are going to open our new HTML file in browser. So open the folder that contains our code and open it with Chrome. Now I'm going to set this up by moving our reference design to the bottom like this, so that it's easier for us to copy it with CSS. I'm just going to move that to the corner, and then we can work here. So first, let's work on creating the subscribe button. Just like we learned before, we are going to create a button using HTML. So less than button, greater than. And then inside our button, we are going to have the text subscribe. Now let's save and refresh our page. And now we have our button. Next, we are going to start changing the appearance of this button so that it looks like the subscribe button from YouTube. Let's go into our code, and we are going to start writing some CSS to change the appearance of this HTML element. So to write CSS, we have to create a new element called a style element. This style element is unique in that it doesn't appear visibly on the page. So for example, if we save our file, and then we reload the page, the style element doesn't actually create anything. So the purpose of this element is that inside this element, we can write CSS code, which modifies the appearance of other elements. For example, let's write our first bit of CSS code. We are going to type button, open squiggly bracket, close squiggly bracket. And then inside these brackets, we are basically going to give instructions to the computer on how to modify the appearance. Background color, colon, red, and semicolon. So make sure that you write this out exactly as I have it here, so that we are following the syntax rules for CSS. You can see that we set the background color of the button to red. So CSS is similar to HTML. We are simply giving instructions to the computer. But we need to follow CSS syntax rules. The word at the front here is called a CSS selector. It tells a computer which elements on the page we are targeting with our CSS code. In this case, we are targeting all buttons on the page. And we are going to change the background color of all buttons on the page to red. Now inside these brackets, there are other rules that we have to follow. The text to the left of this colon is called the CSS property. It tells a computer what we are changing. To the right of the colon is the CSS value. It tells the computer what we are changing the property to. In this case, we are changing the property background color to red. And that's exactly what the computer did. The colon is here to just separate the property and the value. And the semicolon here is just like a period in English. In English, you end sentences with a period. In CSS, you end a style with a semicolon. So that's what all of this syntax means. So we can actually add multiple styles inside these brackets. So let's go ahead and add another style. We are going to change the text color to white to match this design. So the property for changing the text color is called color. So notice that it's not called text color, it's just something that we have to remember. We are going to change it to white and we'll end it with a semicolon. Let's save and refresh. And now you can see that we changed the text color of this button to white. And that's basically how CSS works. We tell the computer what we are targeting, and then we give some styles, and the computer is going to apply these styles one by one. So let's do another example. This time, we'll set the border property. So notice that our button has a border while the subscribe button here doesn't have a border. So we are going to set the border property to none. We are going to save this file and refresh. And now we just remove the border. So if you look at our styles here, it's actually pretty straightforward. They're pretty easy to read. We set the background color to red, text color to white, and border to none. So just like HTML, CSS is pretty straightforward. We are essentially just giving the computer instructions. We are going to continue changing styles one by one until we get our design here. The next style I'm going to change is the height. So our button is a little bit short. I'm going to make it taller. So I'm going to set the height to something like 50 px. The px here represents pixels. Pixels are a very common unit of measurement in the digital world. Image sizes are measured in pixels, video sizes are measured in pixels, and your screen size is also measured in pixels. In this case, we are going to set the button height to 50 pixels. The more that you write CSS and work with pixels, the more you get a sense for how big these measurements turn out to be. So for now, let's save this file and refresh the page. And now we have a button that is 50 pixels tall, but it actually looks like it's a little too tall. So I'm going to change the height to something like 30 pixels, and we are going to refresh the page again. And I actually want it to be a little bit taller. So I'm going to change it to maybe 36. I'm going to refresh. And I think that looks pretty good to me. So you see that in CSS, we do a lot of trial and error to get our measurements right. Now let's keep working step by step to get to our design. Next, we are going to adjust the width. So let's change this to something like 100 pixels. Refresh it. And I think it looks a little bit too small. So I'm going to increase it just a little bit, 105. And refresh. Okay, I think that looks good enough for me. We are going to change the background color because currently our red is not the same as our design. So VS Code has a really nice feature, which is a color picker. So if we hover over this color box here, it gives us access to a color picker that we can pick another color with. So I'm going to pick something that's a little closer to what I see at the bottom. I'm going to pick something like 200,000. Save and refresh. That looks close enough. You might be wondering what this value means. We went from red color to RGB 200,000. So RGB value is another way of measuring color. It's a more precise way of measuring color than just using a word like red or white. Every color can be created using a combination of red, green, and blue. That's what this syntax represents. The R represents how much red we have in this color. G represents how much green and B represents how much blue. Three numbers represent how much red we have, how much green, and how much blue. The minimum value is 0 and the maximum value is 255. And the next thing we are going to change is, you might not be able to see it, but if we zoom, this button has rounded corners, while our button has pointy corners. So to make rounded corners, the CSS property for doing that is border radius, and the border radius takes a pixel measurement. The higher the pixels, the more round the corners will be. So for now, let's try colon to pixels and save. Now if we refresh the page, our button now has rounded corners just like our design. Last thing I'm going to change is if we hover over this button, you'll notice that our mouse turns into this sort of hand. This hand is called a pointer. So we are going to change the cursor. The mouse, this thing that you point around, is usually called a cursor. And we are going to change the cursor to a pointer. Let's save and refresh. And that's how you get this hand whenever your mouse is over this button. So that's basically how we go from a basic HTML button to something that looks more professional, and then we set the styles one by one. Now, you might be wondering, how do I know all of these CSS properties? How are you supposed to memorize them all? Usually, when I don't know the CSS property for something, for example, if I want to create rounded corners, I would go to Google and search for something like CSS and what I want to do. Let's say rounded corners. Usually, the first few links give some good suggestions on what property to use. Here, right away, we have the border radius property in the first link, and it even gives us some sample code. That's how I discovered these CSS properties. I look at a design and ask myself, what do I need to achieve this design? And then I searched for it on Google. As you use CSS more, you'll get used to searching for things you don't know. The next step is to copy this subscribe button to create a new join button. So, let's create a new button in our HTML. This is going to be the join button, so we'll put the text join inside this button. Save it and refresh. Unfortunately, our join button is styled exactly like the subscribe button. That's because, in our CSS, the word button here means that all of these styles are being applied to all buttons on the page. So, how do we make sure these styles only apply to the subscribe button? We are going to learn a new HTML attribute for this. In the previous lesson, we learned that attributes modify the behavior of elements. In this lesson, we are going to learn a very useful attribute that is widely used in CSS. Let's go back to the opening tag of the subscribe button and add a new attribute called the class attribute. Type class equal. The class attribute essentially lets us label HTML elements. For example, let's label this button as subscribe button. And my code here is getting a bit long, so I'm going to put the text on a new line to make it easier to read. Remember, extra spaces in HTML are ignored, so this won't affect our code. Now that we've set the class attribute, we've essentially set a label for this button that we can target in our CSS. To target a class in CSS, we start with a dot, followed by the class name. So, we'll type .subscribe-button. Starting with a dot means we are targeting a class name rather than an element name like button. So here, we are going to target any element with the class subscribe button. If we save and refresh, now you'll see that all these styles only apply to elements with the class subscribe button, and our join button has no styles. Now, multiple elements can have the same class. For example, if I set the class of the join button to subscribe button, all these styles will be applied to any element within that class. So if we save and refresh, now the join button has the styles again because it shares the subscribe button class. But for our purposes, we want this join button to have a different style. So, let's give it a different class name. I'll set the class of the join button to join button. And I'll reformat my code a bit to make it easier to read. Now we are back to where we can start modifying our join button. Let's style our join button to match the design. Remember, the general approach is to create the element in HTML and then style it step by step until it matches the design. First, we'll target the join button class in CSS by typing .joinButton. Let's set the background color to white. Save it and refresh. Next, let's deal with the border. The border looks a bit gray, so let's set the border color to blue and see how it looks. Save and refresh. It looks darker than our design. So, let's pick a more accurate color using a color picker. Don't worry if it's not exact. I'll pick a lighter shade of blue. Save and refresh. That's looking better. However, we notice the border looks a bit off. It's lighter on the top and darker on the bottom. To fix this, we'll set the border style to solid. Let's save and refresh. Now we get a solid color all around. The border also looks a bit thick. So we'll change the border width to 1 pixel. Save and refresh. That looks good. Now, let's set the text color to match the border. The property to set text color is simply color, followed by the color value. I'll copy the color code from the border, paste it here, save and refresh. Next, we'll set the height and width to match the subscribe button. Let's set the height to 36 pixels and refresh. For the width, let's try 60 pixels and see how that looks. Save and refresh. Now adjust it to 62 pixels. Save and refresh. That's better. Finally, give it some rounded corners by setting border radius to 2 pixels. Let's save it and refresh. And now we are almost there to match this design. The last one we are going to set is the cursor pointer to get that nice hand pointer when we are hovering over the button. So, refresh now. When we are hovering over the join button, we have this nice pointer icon. So, another thing we notice is that there's a lot of space between these two buttons and there's not a lot of space between ours. So, in CSS, space is called margin. So, to add space, we are going to add some margin. So, let's go to the subscribe button styles and we are going to add some margin right. So, we are going to add some margin or some space to the right of this button. And we are going to set the space to maybe 8 pixels. Save and refresh. Pretty good to me. So, now we are done with the join button. Lastly, we are going to create this tweet button. Let's go back into our code, and remember our general technique is to, number 1, create the element with HTML, and then, number 2, style it with CSS, one by one. So, we are going to create a button with the text tweet. So now, this button has the same style as the join button because it has a join button class, and that's being targeted up here. So, instead of the join button, we are going to give it a class or a label of tweet button. And I'll save and refresh. We are going to target the class. So, we start with a dot to target a class. We are going to target the tweet button class. So, just like our other buttons, we are going to adjust the style of this button one by one until we match our design. So, let's start off with the background color. Let's set this to blue to start off with. Now, I'm going to try my best to match the Twitter blue that we have here. So, I'm gonna pick something like this. Let's change the color now to white, so that'll change the text color. Let's get rid of the border. Let's give it a height of 36 pixels to match our other buttons. Now, we are going to adjust the width to maybe 105. Let's see how that looks. Okay, that's a little too much. Let's adjust it to 70. Now, to get this rounded effect, we can set a border radius. If we set the border radius to half of that, which is 18, save and refresh, that's how we get this rounded color. The last thing we are going to do is bold the text in here. So in our design, this tweet text here is very bold. We are going to make our font bold as well. So to do that, we are going to set this property called font weight. I'm going to set it to bold. Save and refresh. Okay, it looks pretty good. It looks like this font is actually a little bigger than ours, so let's actually set the font size. Set it to maybe 15. See how that looks. Save and refresh. Okay, I think that looks pretty close. I'm going to change the width to maybe 74. I think is good enough. Currently, we are just trying to copy things by eye. Later, I'll show you a technique of how to copy these colors and measurements exactly. But for now, it's good enough to be able to achieve these designs just by looking at them. So the last thing for this button is to add the cursor pointer. Let's save it and refresh. So if we hover over this button, we now get a nice pointer for our cursor. So the last thing I'm going to adjust here is the spacing between these two buttons. Remember, spacing in CSS is called margin. So we are going to add margin to the left. Let's make it 8 pixels, like we had it for the subscribe button. Let's save it and refresh. And there we go. So we took our basic buttons and we were able to copy these really nice looking designs just by looking at them. And the technique that we use for doing this is, first, we create the element with HTML, and then we style it with CSS, one by one, until it looks close enough to our design. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next part. Subscribe our channel to get notified.